In August of 1945, Japan was not just losing a war, it was losing a world. Entire cities had been erased from maps. Train lines led to nowhere. Families slept in burned-out shells of homes, listening to the distant hum of American bombers as if it were a force of nature, inevitable, unstoppable. Food was scarce, hope even scarcer. And yet, at the very center of this collapsing empire, there was still one man whose fate remained strangely untouched by the devastation around him: the Emperor. For decades, Emperor Hirohito had existed less as a man and more as an idea. To millions of Japanese citizens, he was not merely a ruler, he was sacred, a living bridge between heaven and earth. His face rarely appeared in public. His voice had never been heard on the radio. His words, when conveyed at all, were filtered through layers of ritual and bureaucracy. He did not campaign, he did not debate, he reigned in silence. But silence does not mean absence. As Japan expanded across Asia in the 1930s and early 1940s, into China, Korea, Southeast Asia, the emperor's name was invoked everywhere. Soldiers marched in his honor, orders were issued in his name. Death itself was framed as a sacred offering to him. And when atrocities followed, as they inevitably did, they too unfolded beneath the banner of imperial authority. By the time 1945 arrived, the illusion of invincibility had shattered. Japan's navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Its air force was crippled. American submarines strangled supply lines. Firebombing raids turned wooden cities into oceans of flame. Tokyo alone had lost more civilians to conventional bombing than either atomic attack would later kill. Still, surrender was unthinkable. Within Japan's leadership, the word itself carried the weight of disgrace. Military hardliners insisted that fighting to the last man was preferable to accepting defeat. Even as children were trained to wield bamboo spears, plans were drawn up for a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands. And throughout all of this, the emperor watched. Hirohito was not a shouting general or a charismatic dictator. He was cautious, reserved, deeply shaped by court tradition, but he was also informed. Daily briefings crossed his desk, maps, casualty figures, reports from the front. He knew Japan was losing. The question was whether acknowledging that reality would destroy the very institution he embodied. Then came August 6th. A single American bomber appeared over Hiroshima. In seconds, the city ceased to exist as a functioning human settlement. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Many more would die slowly, burned, irradiated, unseen by the world. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Even then, surrender was not guaranteed. Some military leaders argued that 1 or even 2 atomic bombs did not change the strategic balance. They believed America might only have a handful. They believed Japan could still force better terms through sheer endurance. It took a final shock, the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan, to collapse those illusions completely. With the possibility of Soviet invasion from the north and American invasion from the south, Japan faced total annihilation. For the first time in his reign, Emperor Hirohito intervened directly. In an emergency imperial conference, as ministers argued bitterly around him, the emperor spoke, not in riddles, not through intermediaries, but plainly. He said the war must end, that the suffering of the people could no longer be justified, that Japan must accept the unendurable. This moment cannot be overstated. For a political system built on imperial distance and divine ambiguity, Hirohito's words were seismic. They broke centuries of precedent, and they triggered immediate backlash. On the night of August 14th, a group of young officers launched a desperate coup attempt. Their plan was simple and terrifying: seize the Imperial Palace, destroy the recording of the Emperor's surrender speech, and force Japan to fight on. Gunfire echoed through palace corridors. Loyal guards clashed with mutineers in the dark. Somewhere inside the complex, aides hid fragile wax discs containing Hirohito's recorded message, the first time an emperor's voice would ever reach the public directly. By dawn, the coup had failed. On August 15th, radios across Japan crackled to life. People gathered in silence, many not even knowing what to expect, and then they heard him. The emperor's voice was soft, formal, archaic. Some listeners struggled to understand the language itself, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan had lost. The war was over. The divine ruler was asking his people to endure defeat for the sake of survival. For many, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath their feet. And now came the question the world was waiting for. What would happen to the emperor? Across Europe, defeated leaders were being hunted down, tried, executed. In Germany, the Nazi hierarchy was dismantled piece by piece. War crimes tribunals promised accountability on an unprecedented scale. To many Allied observers, it seemed obvious that Hirohito would face the same fate. After all, how could the symbolic head of an expansionist empire escape responsibility? But something unusual happened. When American forces occupied Japan, they did not arrest the emperor. They did not put him on trial. Instead, they protected him. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, quickly concluded that removing Hirohito could destabilize the entire country. The emperor was not just a man, he was a psychological anchor. Millions of Japanese citizens understood their world through him. Remove that symbol, MacArthur feared, and Japan might descend into chaos, insurgency, or even civil war. So, a deal, spoken or unspoken, took shape. The emperor would stay, but he would change. In January 1946, Hirohito issued a declaration unlike anything in Japanese history. He renounced his divine status. He stated plainly that the bond between emperor and people was not based on myth or godhood. With those words, a tradition stretching back over 2,000 years collapsed. The living God became a human being. This transformation was carefully managed. Hirohito began appearing in public, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in simple Western suits. He toured devastated towns. He spoke with farmers and factory workers. For many Japanese citizens, this was the first time they had ever seen their emperor as a man of flesh and blood. Behind the scenes, however, a far more controversial process was unfolding. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted Japan's generals, ministers, and military planners. Some were executed, others imprisoned for life. Testimony was heard about massacres, forced labor, human experimentation. The emperor's name surfaced repeatedly, and yet he was never charged. American occupation authorities deliberately shaped the narrative presented in court. Responsibility was concentrated downward onto military leaders and cabinet officials. The emperor was framed as a constitutional monarch who had been misled or constrained by aggressive subordinates. Whether this was justice or expediency remains one of the most debated questions in modern history, because the truth was far more complicated. Hirohito had approved military campaigns. He had sanctioned expansions. He had received detailed briefings about the war's progress. He was neither mere puppet nor an all-powerful dictator. He existed in a gray zone, one that did not fit neatly into Western legal categories of guilt. And that gray zone saved him. As Japan rebuilt under American supervision, a new constitution stripped the emperor of all political power. He became a symbol only of unity, continuity, and national identity. Japan renounced war. Democratic institutions took root. Economic recovery followed at astonishing speed. Through it all, Hirohito remained quiet, observant, carefully neutral. To the outside world, he was a paradox, a man whose reign encompassed some of the worst violence of the 20th century, yet who presided over one of its most remarkable recoveries. But unresolved questions never truly disappear. In countries once occupied by Japan, anger simmered. Protests followed Hirohito on overseas visits decades later. Survivors and descendants asked the same question again and again. How could the emperor walk free while others paid with their lives? Inside Japan, the debate was more subdued, but no less real. And that debate did not end with his death. As the decades passed, Emperor Hirohito learned how to exist inside his survival. He never publicly apologized for the war, not once. He expressed deep regret in carefully chosen language, but never responsibility. Each word was weighed, negotiated, filtered through diplomats and advisors who understood that even a single sentence could reopen wounds across Asia. Instead, Hirohito retreated into precision. He became meticulous, reserved, almost invisible again, but in a different way. Where once he had been hidden by divinity, now he was hidden by neutrality. He attended ceremonies, he received foreign dignitaries, he waved from balconies, he smiled politely, spoke sparingly, and avoided anything that could be interpreted as political judgment. To some, this restraint looked like wisdom. To others, it looked like avoidance. Few outside Japan knew that the emperor spent his private hours studying marine biology. He published academic papers on hydrozoans, tiny sea organisms most people never notice. In another life, he might have been remembered as a scientist, and in some strange way, that was exactly the point. The former divine ruler of a fallen empire now devoted himself to the smallest, most unassuming forms of life. There was symbolism there, whether intentional or not. A man once worshipped as eternal, now focused on fragility. But history is not only written by what is said, it is shaped by what is left unsaid. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Japan transformed at breathtaking speed. Bullet trains replaced ruins, factories replaced ashes, consumer electronics flowed into global markets. The nation reinvented itself as peaceful, modern, efficient, and the emperor remained the constant thread. For many Japanese citizens, Hirohito was no longer associated with war, but with recovery. He had stayed, he had endured humiliation, renounced divinity, and walked among the people. In a country where continuity holds profound cultural weight, that mattered deeply. Yet outside Japan, memory moved differently. In China, Korea, the Philippines, and beyond, Hirohito was remembered not as a symbol of healing, but as the figurehead of conquest. His visits abroad sparked protests. Survivors held signs demanding accountability. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions that diplomats tried to soften. How could reconciliation exist without responsibility? How could justice be selective? Defenders of the post-war decision argue that sparing Hirohito prevented bloodshed, that Japan's peaceful transition depended on psychological stability, that prosecuting the emperor might have radicalized millions who still believed in him as sacred. Critics counter that this logic prioritized order over morality, that it allowed an entire society to externalize guilt, that by preserving the emperor, the Allies helped create a narrative where responsibility was fragmented, diluted, and displaced. Both arguments hold truth, and that is precisely why Hirohito's legacy refuses to settle into a single judgment. He died in 1989 at the age of 87. By then, he had reigned longer than any emperor before him. His passing marked the end of the Showa era, an era that encompassed militarism, catastrophe, surrender, occupation, and rebirth. Millions lined the streets for his funeral. Ancient rituals blended with modern state ceremony. Cameras captured the quiet gravity of a nation saying goodbye to a figure who had outlived the world that created him. But death did not close the debate. Historians continue to argue over how much Hirohito knew, when he knew it, and what power he truly wielded. Newly released documents complicate old assumptions. Some suggest deeper involvement. Others reinforce the limits imposed by military elites. No single archive provides a final answer. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. Hirohito was spared not because history absolved him, but because history needed him. He was useful to the occupiers who sought stability, to a nation desperate for continuity, and to a world eager to move forward rather than linger in moral reckoning. The choice to let him live reshaped Japan's post-war identity. It allowed reconstruction without revolution, peace without purge, memory without full confrontation. Whether that was the right choice depends on what one believes justice is meant to do: punish, stabilize, heal, or simply allow the future to exist. The emperor survived the war not because he was innocent and not because he was all-powerful, but because he occupied a space where power, myth, and fear intersected. A man too symbolic to destroy, too compromised to celebrate, too important to remove. And so he remained, standing quietly at the center of modern Japan, a reminder that history does not always deliver clean endings. Sometimes it chooses survival over judgment, and leaves the verdict to us.